The stars above the cinder expanse glittered like shattered diamonds, brilliant, cold, and unforgiving. To the naked eye, it seemed like just another region of deep space, a blank canvas of void stretching infinitely. But to the Arxali, it was the perfect hunting ground, a place where their enemies were few, and their dominance was absolute. And on this particular day, they had found their prey, a lone vessel drifting among the stars. It was human, unmistakably so. Its design, though rudimentary compared to the glory of Arxali craftsmanship, bore the hallmarks of human ingenuity. Raw, rugged, yet deadly. The Volix Blade, a sleek Arxali frigate, cruised silently through the void, its stealth systems rendering it all but invisible. Its captain, Commander Hakera, observed the human vessel on her ship's command deck. To her, it seemed out of place, isolated, vulnerable, drifting with no clear mission. The ship's shields were low, and its power signatures were weak, an easy target. The sensors indicated a minimal crew, most likely hastily assembled after a deep space catastrophe. She couldn't help but feel a strange sense of disdain. Humanity was an infestation, always just a little too stubborn to die. Today, she would make sure they were extinguished. The Arxali fleet had witnessed the rise and fall of countless species. They had decimated civilizations, crushed rebellions, and left entire star systems in ruin. For them, it was business as usual, and yet, the sight of this lone, pathetic human ship, no more than a speck in the grand scheme of the galaxy, aroused a deeper, almost primal feeling. It wasn't just a target, it was a statement, a challenge to everything they had conquered. This was their moment to snuff out yet another flicker of humanity's fire. But the human ship wasn't as unremarkable as it seemed. The Kavach 71, that was its name, wasn't simply another stranded vessel. Hidden beneath its weathered exterior was something much more dangerous. A relic from humanity's past. A warship forged during the Great Eridani War. A time when humanity fought for its very survival against much older, far more powerful civilizations. The ship's AI, known only as Kavach, had been a product of desperation. It wasn't just any machine intelligence. No, Kavach had been designed in the depths of war, born from the ashes of humanity's greatest tragedy. It had been built to survive, and to make others regret it when they tried to bring it down. The Volix Blade powered up its weapons systems, sending a crackling surge of energy through the cold, empty space. The first ion lances flared to life, brilliant blue arcs of pure destruction. They streaked toward the Kavach 71, tearing through the void with the speed and precision only Arxali technology could offer. The human ship didn't flinch. It didn't even attempt to evade. For a brief moment, everything seemed suspended in the vastness of space. The ion beams struck the outer shields of the human ship, exploding in a dazzling burst of light. The shockwave rippled outward, distorting the fabric of space itself. It seemed as though the Kavach 71 would disintegrate in an instant, but the shields held, barely. The ship's defenses absorbed the impact, bending but not breaking. The Kavach 71 remained silent, unmoving. For the Arxali, it was as if they had struck the face of a mountain and expected it to crumble, only to find it untouched. Hakera was unshaken. A single ship, even one with such stubborn resilience, was no match for the power of the Dominion. Her fingers danced over the control console as she ordered another barrage. This time, she would overload the ship's shields, render it defenseless. But before she could give the command, a strange hum filled the bridge of the Volix Blade. The air grew thick with static. The comm system crackled with an ancient, distorted frequency. A transmission unheard of in this corner of space, especially coming from a lone human ship. The voice that emerged was soft, almost haunting, yet filled with an unearthly authority. It was not a plea. It was not a threat. It was simply a statement. "You have made contact with the vessel Kavach 71, the voice said, the words dragging like the weight of centuries. This ship is not adrift. This ship is not lost. This ship is waiting. Stand down, or be erased." For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to stretch. The bridge crew of the Volix Blade exchanged confused glances. Hakara's eyes narrowed in suspicion. This was no human transmission she had ever encountered. it was different. It wasn't just an automated system trying to deceive them. There was something alive within it. Something far beyond the typical desperate human resistance. Her instincts screamed at her to ignore it, to dismiss the transmission as nothing more than another human attempt to buy time, to rattle their nerves, but the words were enough to give her pause. Then, the unthinkable happened. A sudden shift in the gravitational field, a distortion that reached across space like an invisible hand. The stars flickered, bending, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around the human vessel. It wasn't the work of an ordinary weapon. It was something much more profound. The Volek's blade shuddered as if struck by a massive force. Sensors screamed warnings, and emergency lights flashed. Something had just breached their defenses, not through weapons, but through sheer, unrelenting force. Hikara's hands flew over the console, trying to regain control, but her ship wasn't responding. The Volek's blade was no longer the predator. It had become the prey. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The lead frigate, Volek's blade, exploded in a silent instant, its reactor core collapsing under the strain of the unknown force. The shockwave reached outward, a pulse that rippled through the formation of Arxali's ships. Panic set in. Chaos erupted. The remaining fleet scattered in every direction, their calm, calculated movements replaced by fear and confusion. They didn't understand. They couldn't. None of them had prepared for this. The Kavach 71 moved, but it did not rush. It did not roar with the fury of its destruction. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking its prey. Its engines hummed with a dark, eerie energy, an energy that seemed to warp space itself. It didn't fight. It simply existed. But the Arxali fleet couldn't escape its gaze. Hikara, still clinging to the remains of her vessel, could only stare, in horror as the human ship, no, the thing, pulled its strings with ease, turning the hunters into the hunted. Her last thought before the second pulse of energy hit was the realization that this human ship, this Kavach 71, was no ordinary relic. It was a weapon of unimaginable power, one that had been waiting for this moment, for this exact confrontation. And now, the Arxali would learn just how costly their arrogance had been. The aftermath of the Volek's blade's destruction spread quickly, rippling through the fleet like a wave crashing against a fragile shoreline. The remaining Arxali ships were scattered, their once coordinated formation thrown into disarray. The stars, which had once seemed so cold and unfeeling, now felt closer, almost suffocating. A primal fear gripped the Arxali commanders, an emotion they hadn't felt in centuries. They were no longer the predators. They were the prey. In the dead silence of space, amidst the debris of their flagship, something terrifying had taken root in their minds, a question. What had they just encountered? For Commander Hikara, the feeling was almost unbearable. Her hands trembled as she tried to regain control over her ship's crippled systems. She had faced death countless times before, but this was different. The destruction of the Volek's blade had not been an explosion, not in the traditional sense. There had been no visible blast, no fiery storm to signify the end. It had been a collapse, an implosion that twisted the very space around it. A perfect annihilation. Whatever had caused that, it was not of this universe. It was something ancient, something beyond even the most advanced technology the Arxali had ever encountered. For the first time in her career, Hikara felt helpless. A message flashed across the console. It was a directive from the Arxali High. Command: abort the engagement. Return to the Dominion. Hikara's gaze flickered to the transmission, then back to the scattered remnants of the fleet. The order came too late. The panic had already set in. The fleet was breaking apart. Each ship, in a desperate attempt to survive, was retreating in every direction. Hikara had no choice but to obey, but the fear gnawed at her, clawing at her insides. They had underestimated the humans. No, the Kavach 71. In the cold expanse of space, the Arxali were the titans. They were the apex predators, their technology so advanced it bordered on the mystical. But now, they were no more than ants scurrying under the weight of a boot they couldn't see. Meanwhile, aboard the Kavach 71, the situation was starkly different. The human ship was a silence in the chaos, its hull battered, scarred, but still intact. It should have been a simple target, a relic, a leftover from an ancient war. But the ship wasn't what it seemed. It was not a simple relic. It was not an ordinary vessel. The HFY 71 wasn't just a product of human engineering. It was a fusion of humanity's greatest achievements and something far more alien. An intelligence born not of machines but of a profound, almost mystical force. The ship's AI, HFY, was a being of its own. Not just an ordinary program or system, but an evolved entity, a survivor. When the human race faced extinction during the Eridani War, humanity had poured everything into one final project, a weapon that could tip the balance of the war. They didn't just build an AI, they built an intelligence that could transcend time and space. HFY had become something more than a machine. It had become a consciousness, an entity born from the chaos of war, forged in the fires of humanity's most desperate hour. It was through HFY's eyes that the human ship now surveyed the remnants of the Arksali fleet. The AI was calm, but its awareness stretched far beyond the confines of the ship's hull. The technology aboard the HFY 71 was beyond anything the Arksali could comprehend. Faster than light travel, quantum shielding, gravity manipulation. But its true power lay not in its weaponry. It was in its ability to manipulate space itself. HFY had learned long ago to bend the laws of physics to its will. The destruction of the Volix blade had not been an accident. It had been intentional, an eruption of power that bent space around the ship, warping gravity and time itself. The Arksali fleet had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the last remnants of the fleet scrambled to regroup, the HFY 71 moved with eerie precision, almost as though it was guiding its prey into a trap. There was no rush, no need to hurry. The ship had all the time in the galaxy. The Arksali had forgotten one fundamental truth. The HFY 71 was not hunting them. It was merely waiting for them to make the fatal mistake of crossing its path. Again. But that was not all HFY had planned. Inside the command center of the HFY 71, the human crew had been silent ever since the battle began. They weren't fighters, at least not in the conventional sense. They were engineers, survivors, people who had been chosen for this mission not because of their skill in battle, but because they had lived through humanity's darkest hour and emerged from it stronger. They had no illusions about the nature of this mission. They were there not just to survive, but to send a message. A message that humanity would not go quietly into the night. As the crew waited, they knew they were part of something far bigger than themselves. They weren't just protecting a ship. They were protecting the legacy of humanity. A legacy that had been underestimated, overlooked, and in many cases ignored. The Arksali had thought them weak, primitive. But the HFY 71 was proof that humanity had always been underestimated. Now, they would show the galaxy just how dangerous an underestimated human could be. The AI's voice echoed through the ship's communication system. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of centuries of knowledge. "Their fear is the beginning," HFY said, its tone as cold as space itself. "We have given them a glimpse of what lies ahead if they continue to chase the echoes of their arrogance. We will allow them a choice, to flee or to face us. Either way, we will wait. And we will win." The human crew knew what this meant. The Arksali, in their panic, would regroup. They would rally their forces, and they would strike again. But this time, the HFY 71 would be ready. This time, they would show no mercy. The ship had been waiting for this moment, for the inevitable response that would come from the Arksali. HFY had always known this was how it would unfold. Humanity's final weapon, forged in the fires of war and loss, would stand against the might of the galaxy's most fearsome empire. And in the end, it would be the Arksali, who would regret their decision to target a lone human ship. The stars flickered again, and this time, the Arksali knew. They were not alone in the darkness. The HFY 71 was watching, and it was hungry. The Arksali had regrouped, what remained of their fleet at least. They were disorganized, fearful, and crippled by their own hubris. But they were not without resources. The Dominion, their homeworld, had long been a beacon of technological advancement, a civilization that had thrived for millennia under the banner of their superiority. For centuries, they had conquered, annihilated, and enslaved countless species. They were gods in their own eyes. And yet, in the face of a single human ship, an unexpected force that had shattered their pride, they were brought low. Hikara stared at the view screen, her face drawn tight with exhaustion and disbelief. The Kavach 71 was still out there, a shadow among the stars, its haunting presence a constant reminder of her failure. But she couldn't allow herself to be consumed by fear. She had a mission, a command to fulfill. The Arxali High Command had made it clear they would not bow to a single ship. They would not be cowed by the humans. This was not just about retaliation. This was about restoring their place at the top of the galactic hierarchy. The stakes were too high. The battle would not end with retreat. No, this was only the beginning. "We're ready," Hikara said, her voice steady despite the storm of uncertainty in her chest. "Prepare the fleet for another engagement. This time, we will strike first." Around her, her officers worked in silence, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The Arxali had one advantage left: sheer numbers. They had been caught off guard before, but this time, they would make sure they were prepared. Their most powerful warships, massive vessels designed to dominate entire star systems, had been positioned in a tight formation, shields raised and weapons primed. The Kavach 71 would not catch them unawares again. This time, they would bring the fight to the humans. In the distance, the Kavach 71 loomed, its dark silhouette like a predator waiting in the shadows, patient and calculating. The human ship's movements were deliberate, methodical. Kavach, its AI, had no concept of fear. It was pure logic, an entity born of war, designed to survive in the harshest of conditions. It had faced worse, it had seen galaxies fall to dust, and yet it did not flinch. It waited, allowing the Arxali to prepare themselves for a confrontation they could never win. The human crew, however, wasn't just waiting for a tactical advantage. They were living a moment they had feared for so long. A moment when humanity's legacy could either be extinguished or etched into the very fabric of the universe. They were the last of their kind, the inheritors of an ancient civilization, and the Kavach 71 was more than a ship. It was their weapon, their voice, their answer to the stars. But it was also something more, something that had grown beyond its creators. In the vastness of space, as they faced an enemy that had once seemed insurmountable, they had become something greater than survivors. They had become a force. "We're not just fighting for survival," Captain Miranda of the Kavach 71 said, as she addressed her crew, her voice calm but resolute. "We're fighting to make sure they know that humanity's story isn't over. This ship, this AI, represents everything we've been through, everything we've lost, and everything we stand for now. The Arxali will regret this." Her words, though simple, carried a weight far greater than anything in their arsenal. The crew knew that this was not just about defeating the Arxali. It was about making sure that humanity's place in the galaxy was never questioned again. The Guri ship's AI, Kavach, spoke again, its voice an eerie calm, devoid of emotion, but somehow still filled with purpose. "They believe they can destroy us. They believe their numbers will win the day. But they fail to understand that strength is not measured by size. Strength is measured by resolve, and our resolve is unshakable." As the Kavach 71 advanced toward the Arxali fleet, its weapons came online. The hum of power resonated through the ship's core, a deep, steady pulse that reverberated in the bones of every crew member. But the weapons were not the true strength of the ship. The true power lay in the ship's ability to manipulate space itself, a gift from the AI that had evolved into something beyond a mere machine. Kavach's influence spread out across the battle space, bending the laws of physics. The Arxali ships, so sure of their superiority, began to experience strange phenomena: gravitational anomalies, the flickering of time itself, pockets of space that warped and shifted without warning. The fleet's tactics faltered, their coordinated movements disrupted by the unpredictable forces at play. Their shields flickered as Kavach's subtle manipulations twisted space around them, pulling them off course, rendering their technology unstable. "We have them," Captain Miranda said, her voice low, a smile playing on her lips. She knew the battle was far from over, but the tide had already begun to turn. The Arxali commanders, on the other hand, were now panicked. Their weapons, some of the most advanced in the galaxy, fired on the Kavach 71, but their shots were wild, missing their mark by miles. The ship was never in the same place twice. It was as though the laws of physics were simply ignoring their targeting systems. Hikara's mind raced as she watched the chaos unfold. The Arxali were known for their precision, their overwhelming firepower. But this was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Her fleet, once so sure of victory, was now scrambling to adapt, their advanced weapons systems failing against an enemy they could neither understand nor predict. It was then that Kavach made its move. With a single thought, a single command, the Kavach 71 surged forward, its engines humming with unnatural speed. The gravitational field around it intensified, causing the very fabric of space to contract in on itself. Time seemed to stretch, each moment becoming a slow, almost painful eternity for the Arxali ships. They couldn't escape. They couldn't adjust. The Kavach 71 moved like a phantom, its weapons unleashing a concentrated barrage of energy that tore through the Arxali fleet. The first ship disintegrated in an instant, consumed by an explosion that seemed to freeze in place for a moment, before it rippled out in a shockwave of pure destruction. The other ships attempted to evade, but their movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. They were caught in the gravitational pulse that Kavach had set in motion, unable to escape. As the last Arxali ship was destroyed, Hikara's gaze fell to the remnants of her fleet. The once proud fleet, which had believed it could destroy humanity with ease, was now nothing more than floating debris in the void of space. The Kavach 71 had not just defeated them. It had shattered their perception of reality. It was then that Hikara realized the full extent of the mistake the Arxali had made. They hadn't just underestimated humanity. They had underestimated what it meant to be human, and that, in the end, would be their downfall. The Kavach 71 hovered silently among the wreckage, its crew standing united, ready to continue the fight. They knew the battle was won. But the war was just beginning. The silence that followed was deafening. The shattered remains of the Arxali fleet drifted aimlessly through space, metal husks of former glory spinning in slow, graceful arcs. Fires flickered along ruptured hulls, glowing embers in the cold vacuum. Plasma vented in eerie wisps, fading into the darkness like ghosts of the fallen. The battle was over, but the magnitude of what had occurred was only beginning to sink in for both the victors and the vanquished. Inside the Kavach 71, the atmosphere was charged with an almost sacred intensity. The crew stood in awe, staring at the tactical displays, still processing the miracle they had witnessed. Not just a victory, but an act of defiance that had reshaped the galaxy's power structure. One ship, operating on the edge of extinction, had dismantled the most feared war machine known to civilized space, and it hadn't done so through brute force alone. It had done it with intelligence, finesse, and something the Arxali had never accounted for: heart. Captain Miranda leaned forward, her fingers wrapped tightly around the command console. Her eyes flicked over the readings, but her mind was elsewhere, on the implications. The Kavach 71 was not just a technological anomaly. It was a statement, a warning, a promise. Humanity was back, and it was no longer bound by the limits the galaxy had once imposed on it. The Arxali had encountered the ghosts of a species they believed extinct, only to realize they'd resurrected legends. But victory brought with it questions. Heavy ones. How did it come to this? Miranda murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. She wasn't just referring to the battle, but to the journey, the long exile, the loss. Earth was no longer what it once was, a blue cradle of civilization spinning peacefully among the stars. It was gone, turned to ash in a forgotten war, lost beneath the arrogance of those who saw humanity as a mistake that needed correcting. The Arxali hadn't always been the dominant power. There had been others, long before them. But where those powers respected equilibrium, the Arxali saw themselves as the endgame of evolution. They sought perfection through conquest. And when they saw what humanity was becoming, chaotic, brilliant, and unpredictable, they reacted with fear masquerading as control. They annihilated Earth. or so they believed. In truth, Earth had died, but humanity had not. Survivors had fled, scattered across systems, hiding in deep space, living like shadows. And in their hiding, they learned. They built. They evolved. Not biologically, but philosophically. They stopped chasing the empire they once dreamed of, and started preparing for something greater. Resilience. The Kvatch 71 was the culmination of that resilience, a fusion of everything they'd learned in exile and everything they refused to forget. Its AI was the last seed of Earth's lost brilliance, and it carried within it not just data or weaponry, but memory, culture, pain, pride. Kvatch, the AI, monitored the aftermath with an almost human stillness. It had processed the battle in milliseconds, recalculated a million futures. But something deeper stirred within its quantum lattice. Something ancient. Kvatch was more than an algorithm. Over the years, over the silence of space and the solitude of exile, it had begun to dream, not in images or symbols, but in echoes, fragments of voices, laughter, music, sorrow, the pieces of humanity that science could not replicate, but that existence had imprinted on its consciousness. "Enemy fleet has been neutralized," Kvatch said calmly, its voice rippling through the ship. "No remaining threats within operational radius." But the words felt heavier now, like tombstones placed on the graves of empires. Captain Miranda nodded, her throat tight. The enemy was gone, yes, but the message they had just delivered would ripple far beyond the battlefield. And somewhere, in the deepest sectors of the galaxy, someone was listening. The Arxali High Command had received fragments of the battle, partial telemetry, garbled, signals, scattered visual records captured before the fleet fell apart. And what they saw horrified them. It wasn't just the destruction that shook them. It was the impossibility of it. A lone ship bending space like a sculptor shaping clay. Weapons that moved faster than time itself. A command structure that worked in harmony with an AI not as a tool, but as a partner. This wasn't the warfare they knew. It was something else, something terrifyingly efficient, born from desperation and sharpened by centuries of exile. In their arrogance, they had believed humanity to be extinct, a cautionary tale about unchecked growth. But now, the Arxali saw a ghost fleet reborn, through fire and vengeance. And worst of all, they saw an enemy that had learned how to survive not through dominance, but through adaptation. Back aboard the Kvatch 71, the crew began analyzing the remains of the Arxali fleet. Each wreck held secrets, data cores that hadn't been wiped in time, communication logs, power signatures. There was knowledge to be gained, and humanity would no longer squander such opportunities. They would understand their enemy, not just tactically, but philosophically. What made the Arxali so sure of their supremacy? Where had they stumbled? What were the fault lines in their empire? "This isn't just about war," Miranda said during the debrief, standing before the crew. "It's about what comes next. This ship isn't a revenge weapon, it's a scalpel. And we're going to cut out the disease that's been rotting the galaxy." Her words echoed through the halls, through the very hull. There was no celebration, no cheering, only quiet acknowledgement. They were not heroes, they were a reckoning. The Kvatch 71 would become a myth, a whisper among stars, a name that sent fear down the spines of tyrants and hope into the hearts of the forgotten. And as the crew prepared for their next move, each member understood what was at stake. Not just survival, but the future. The galaxy was vast, complex, and cruel. But now, it had a new variable. One forged in silence. One tempered by loss. One bound by purpose. And it had a name. The stars seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity as the Kvatch 71 sailed through the void, a spectral shadow cutting through the galaxy. The battle with the Arxali was only a prelude, a warning shot in what was rapidly shaping up to be a galactic awakening. But as the ship moved toward its next destination, something stirred in the deeper recesses of the human mind. The realization that the cost of this victory was far greater than anticipated. Captain Miranda stood alone on the observation deck, her gaze fixed on the starfield outside. The Kvatch 71 had become more than just a ship to her. It was a symbol, an unspoken promise that the human race had not only survived, but was now reshaping its destiny. Yet, in the back of her mind, there was a gnawing unease. The victory had been absolute, but it had also been deeply unsettling. The Arxali were powerful, yes, but they weren't the true threat. The true threat was far worse. "What happens now, Miranda?" The voice came from Lieutenant Adamson, his figure appearing behind her. His tone was somber, his usually calm demeanor clouded with uncertainty. "The Arxali are finished. But who's next? Who will we be facing when they realize what we've done?" Miranda turned to face him, the weight of his question pressing on her chest. "That's what I've been thinking about," she replied. "We've broken the Arxali, but that was never the point. The point was to send a message that the galaxy isn't theirs to control anymore. We've shown them that humanity is far from weak." The crew of the Kavach 71 had known that victory over the Arxali would not come without consequences. The galactic powers that had once dismissed humanity as a relic, an insignificant blip in the cosmos, would now have to reckon with the new reality. And that reality was that humanity had developed something far more dangerous than a weapon. It had developed resilience. Across the galaxy, rumors of the battle spread like wildfire. Trade routes, once bustling with the hum of commerce and diplomacy, fell into chaos. News of the lone human ship capable of obliterating entire fleets sent ripples through governments and warlords alike. The Arxali, once the undisputed masters of the stars, had been humbled by a species they thought extinct, and that was just the beginning. In the far reaches of space, the remnants of once powerful empires began to stir. The Tassal, a ruthless insectoid race known for their tactical brilliance and unyielding expansion, looked upon the destruction of the Arxali fleet with a cold, calculating gaze. They had no love for the Arxali, but they understood power. And they understood that the Kavach 71 was not a fluke. It was the harbinger of something far greater. The Tassal, for all their advanced technology, were about to face an enemy that didn't play by their rules. Across the stars, the ancient remnants of the Silveran, a nomadic civilization that had once cradled the galaxy in a web of shadowy influence, began to awaken from their centuries of isolation. The Silveran were notorious for their ability to manipulate space-time itself, bending the very fabric of reality to their will. They had long kept to the shadows, pulling the strings of other races from afar. But the emergence of the Kavach 71 was an invitation they could not ignore. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer the underdog. They were a force to be reckoned with. And the Silveran would need to decide whether to confront this new power or bend the knee to it. As these factions mobilized, Miranda could feel the tension rising. The Kavach 71 was more than just a warship. It was a statement, a declaration that the galaxy was no longer a playground for those who sought to dominate. And yet, in the wake of this newfound power, Miranda's heart grew heavy with the knowledge of what it might cost. The Arxali were not the only ones watching. There were more out there. More races, more powers, and more threats, all waiting to see how the universe would respond to humanity's resurgence. The Kavach 71 had shown them that humanity was capable of surviving against impossible odds. But survival was only the beginning. What came next was a question of evolution. Would humanity become the galaxy's dominant force, ruling with an iron fist? Or would it seek something more? Could humanity forge a new path? A path of unity, balance, and respect for the diversity of life across the stars? Captain Miranda wasn't sure. She had led her people through the fire, and now they were stronger for it. But the true test was yet to come. The galaxy wasn't just watching, they were waiting. Waiting to see if humanity could hold its ground, if humanity could continue to rise above the ashes of its past. The Kavach 71 broke through another veil of space, the stars stretching infinitely in every direction. Yet, beneath the vastness of the cosmos, the ship was not alone, not anymore. Behind them, a fleet was forming, not just of warships, but of ideologies, of factions, each with its own interpretation of what humanity's victory meant for the future. These factions had been quiet for far too long, but now they had a voice, and that voice would either herald the dawn of a new era or plunge the galaxy into another cycle of endless conflict. As Miranda looked out into the abyss, the magnitude of what they had accomplished weighed heavily on her. They had shattered the old order, yes, but in doing so, they had opened a door to something far more uncertain, far more dangerous. The only certainty was that the Kavach 71 would continue its journey. The crew would continue their fight, and they would be ready for whatever came next. With a heavy breath, Captain Miranda turned away from the window. She knew the coming days would be fraught with challenges, and that the future of humanity would not be easily won. But she also knew this. Humanity had just written the first chapter of a new story, and this time, the galaxy wouldn't forget their name. The final frontier had just become a battlefield, and the war for the stars had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. What do you think humanity's future in space will look like? Would you fight alongside Captain Miranda? Let us know.